Hi, everyone. I'm Marianne McKeown. I'm Kind's Director of Partnerships and Pro Bono Programs in Europe. And thank you so much for coming and joining us today for this training on this advanced training on trauma-informed care for unaccompanied migrating children. I'm here today with my colleagues from Kind's Social Services team, Jasiel Fernandez, who is the Regional Director of Social Services in the US, and Virginia Moraledo Cabezas from our Baltimore office, who is Social Services Supervisor. And so I want to say thank you so much for everyone for joining us today. This is such an important topic because in our role as legal professionals, we often find ourselves at this very complex intersection between the legal issues that our clients deal with and then the very personal experiences that they come with. And so we all understand that this work is so much more than just, legal rules and procedures and laws. It's about really understanding and recognizing the human experience that we all go into this type of casework with. And so just a little bit of housekeeping before we start. We are recording today's session, so if you have colleagues that are interested, we will be sharing the link afterwards. You can share it with them. Or if you have to step out for a call or something else, you can always come back to the recording afterwards. We will share the link. We'll also share the slides from today's presentation, so you don't have to take notes in that regard. And then at the end of the session, there will be a short survey that will be available. It'll just pop up in your browser. So any feedback that you have on the training would be much appreciated. It's very, very short, but it means a lot to us to get that kind of feedback. And just as we go through the training today, as you have questions, just pop them into the chat. I'll be monitoring it. And then there will be time at the end of the presentation to come back to those questions. So just pop them in as they come to mind. So to start with, if you could perhaps just pop in the chat what you are expecting, what are you hoping to get out of today's session? I think it will be interesting for everyone to be able to see the different perspectives that people are coming to this with, and it will be useful for myself and Jessica and Virginia to be able to address some of the questions and interests that come up. So if you could go ahead and do that, that will be wonderful. And I will then hand over to Virginia to get us started today. Virginia?
Yes. Thank you, Marianne. So yeah, you can just let us know what are your expectations in the chat, as Marianne said. So if you can pass the slide, Marianne, go to the next one. We can review the agenda. So here is our agenda for today. We are first going to start this training by reviewing our client trauma profile. So here we will be basically reviewing some concepts that we discussed in our previous training in June. So this can be like a good refresher for everybody, but it could also be like a great introduction for those who couldn't join at that time. Next, we're going to move into the next block, and here we will be sharing advanced strategies when interviewing and communicating with youth who have experienced trauma. Then we will discuss vicarious or secondary trauma and how this impacts service providers, and also we will be reviewing the signs of burnout. And then we will move to healthy boundaries. So we will introduce some new concepts here, like empathy investment and how to develop a personal philosophy of boundaries. And we will allow some time for Q&As at the end of the presentation. Next slide. Okay, so let's start reviewing these two concepts of trauma and chronic stress. Let's start by trauma. So there are many kinds of events that could be considered traumatic. So this can be, for example, an incident of violence or even being exposed to natural disasters. Traumatic events are events that we can conceptualize are events that are too much, too soon, or too fast. So what happens is that they overwhelm or they can pose a threat to the person's nervous system. We can actually think about trauma as a normal response, as our body and our brain, they are attempting to protect us against very destabilizing circumstances. We have here the definition of trauma. Trauma is the response to an event, series of events, or set of circumstances that is experienced by an individual as physically or emotionally harmful or life-threatening and has lasting adverse effects on the individual's functioning and well-being. And then we have this other concept of chronic stress. There is actually some overlapping between these two concepts of trauma and chronic stress. So when there is trauma, there is always a component of chronic stress. But somebody can have chronic stress and not having trauma. So we have the definition as well here of chronic stress. Chronic stress is a consistent feeling of being pressured or overwhelmed over an extended period of time. Chronic stress usually happens when people experience big changes in their lives. So in the context of our client population, this usually happens when they leave their home country and they move to the new country, and they need to adjust to a new culture or to a new language, for example. In both cases, the idea is that the brain is highly activated. So it's trying to manage a real or perceived threat. Next slide. We're going to be discussing also the impact of trauma, both themes that we have here. We are going to start by the one on the left, which is the impact of trauma in the brain, and then we will move to this pyramid on the right. So about how trauma affects the brain, we know that both trauma and chronic stress have an impact in our brain, and there are three main areas that are impacted. So we first have the amygdala. We say that the amygdala is like a smoke detector. It's like our brain's alarm system. So it's constantly, this part of the brain is constantly activated and constantly scanning the environment and assessing if we are safe. Then we have the next area, which is the hippocampus. The hippocampus is the part of the brain that helps with learning and with memory. So if there is a traumatic event, what happens with the hippocampus is that this shrinks. So people, the person experiencing these traumatic events may struggle with memory and may have difficulty remembering what safety means and what safety feels like. So they might also struggle remembering events, and they might only be able to remember some fragment of events, and they might struggle putting events in chronological order. And then the last area of the brain that it is also impacted by trauma is the prefrontal cortex. So this is the decision-making and the thinking center of the brain. So when there is a traumatic event, like it happens with the hippocampus, the prefrontal cortex, this also shrinks. So it makes harder for the person to engage in rational thinking, also to control their emotions and to manage their behaviors. Now we can move to this pyramid on the right. So this pyramid represents the results of a very relevant study that was conducted here in the United States by the U.S. Centers for Control and Disease Prevention and Kaiser Permanente. This was the first study actually done in 1997, between 1997 and 1995, and 1997. There has been subsequent studies, but this was the initial one. In this one, 17,000 patients participated. And this study focused on how ACEs stands for Adverse Childhood Experiences. So as I was saying, this study focused on how these ACEs may negatively affect adult health. So these ACEs tested individuals for various forms of trauma, like childhood neglect, abandon, domestic violence, sexual abuse, any kind of like feeling of fear or isolation, for example. And you can see here these different steps in this pyramid, which represents the consequences of being exposed to any ACE. So upon exposure to these ACEs, which can be actually directly if somebody has experienced as a child physical abuse, or indirectly, for example, witnessing interpersonal violence. So the youth may experience disruption in neurodevelopment, which can subsequently also impair social, emotional, and cognitive functioning. These impairments also can increase the risk of adoption of health risk behaviors. So here we can talk, for example, about substance abuse, any kind of like substance abuse, which subsequently also can increase the risk for poor health outcomes, which can be any kind of like disease, disability, or social problems. And all these can ultimately lead to early death. So this study is very relevant because it was actually the first time that they were able to prove something that probably all can imagine, right? We can all imagine that if somebody as a child has experienced any of these ACEs, any of these traumatic events in their life, we can all expect that as adults, probably they are not going to be in good health. This can have like some health consequences in their lives. So that was something that we could all have guessed, right? But it was the first time that they were able to prove with research and with science that this is what actually happens when they grow up. So what they found is that there is obviously a connection between trauma and health issues, or trauma and chronic illnesses. And this study also discovered three main things. So the first one is that ACEs are extremely common. The second thing that they discovered is that there was an 87% chance that if you have experienced one ACE, you probably have experienced two or more ACEs. And the third thing that they found is that the higher the ACEs score, the higher likelihood of an individual developing any chronic illness, like, for example, diabetes or heart failure. Next slide. Well, now that we have all together reviewed these concepts and the impact of trauma in the brain, in the body, in our head, we can move and talk about trauma-informed communication. So since unaccompanied migrant children have experienced complex trauma, we as professionals working with them, we need to employ trauma-informed communication strategies to first avoid re-traumatization, and second, also to build a healthy relationship with our clients. You can see on the right some of the strategies that we can employ. So the first one is, for example, interview location. This is something that we also discussed in our previous training. So we're always going to try to conduct our interviews in a space that the client feels safe and feels comfortable. So what we are going to do is to minimize the client vigilance to threat. We are also going to give the client some sense of control about the location. So we can ask the client if they want to decide in which room we're going to be meeting, where do they want to sit in the room, if they want to meet with the door closed or with the door open. Those are small decisions that we can allow the client to make so that we can give the client some agency. Then preparing the client. So because youth who have experienced trauma, they can also struggle with unpredictability and with transitions. We are always going to tell the client about the timing, the location of the interview, the topic of the interview. We will always tell them all this ahead of time. So we can also always start the interview with light topics, right? For example, we can ask the youth or the child about an activity that they have done before our meeting, and then we will introduce the topic of the legal case gradually. So it won't be the first topic that we will be talking about in our conversation. Client control, again, we are going to give the client, if possible, some sense of control throughout the conversation. For example, we can set the agenda in advance. We can ask the client if they want to add anything to the agenda prior to our meeting. You can also try to flatten the hierarchy between attorneys and between clients, explaining to the client that we all have different areas of expertise, right? And while you are the expert or you have the knowledge of the legal field, they are the experts of their lives. They have the knowledge about their experiences and their needs. Then we have note-taking. So tell the client that they can see your notes at any time. You can also invite the client to take their own notes. For the sake of transparency, so you should explain to the client that you are just basically writing down what they are telling you. You can also explain to the client why you are writing this down, how are you going to use this information after the meeting. Transparency should also guide all our conversation and basically our work with the client. This can include things like explaining your role as many times as needed, or if there is any limiting confidentiality with your client, that's something that you should be explaining from the very beginning of the conversation. child's understanding, we work with children, we work with youth, so we always need to adjust our vocabulary and the conversation to them, especially if we are working with tender age children, but also with youth. And even if you are fluent in the language of the client in their first language, or if you are bilingual, that's something that you should always take into consideration, the audience that you are speaking with. Then we have client narratives. So we need to help clients construct clear narratives, right? So if the clients give you like very short answers, or they are unable to remember any events, we can perhaps use some tools so that we can help the client express themselves. So in this sense, play, for example, is a great tool. We can ask the client if they want to draw something. We can use a feeling chart to help the client express how they are feeling. We can use family toys or puppets if we are talking about their family members. We can even work with the client to draw like or create timelines so that it is, in case that it is difficult for them to remember the chronological order of any event that happened in their lives. Then information disclosure, we are going to always respect the client choices about how much information they are sharing with us. So this can be challenging, but the key to overcoming this is, again, transparency. We need to explain to the client why we need this information for, how are we going to use this information, and how this is going to benefit their legal case. So in this way, hopefully the client will be able to make an informed decision. And then interview recap. So at the end of the interview, we always need to summarize the conversation. We need to explain to the child or to the youth how we are going to be using the information that they provided. We can ask if there is something that it needs to be kept confidential. And then we will let them know about the next steps after the conversation. Next step. And then there will be a moment probably that we will be talking about trauma, right, with our clients. And we know that this is probably the aspect that most professionals fear when it comes to working with traumatized clients, right? The exact moment that we are asking them about this traumatic event, that we are talking about their trauma. To face this moment and also to overcome like any obstacles, we can practice different strategies. The first thing that we are always going to do is to address our own fears that limit communication. There is always a fear that we can re-traumatize the client, right? By talking about these traumatic events that happen in their lives. It is true that we cannot do our work without causing occasional distress, but this occasional distress differs from harm. This is different from harm. And we need to approach conversations about trauma with clarity and with compassion. And the reality is that by avoiding these conversations about trauma, there is always a component that we are trying to avoid client re-traumatization, but what we might be trying to avoid is our own distress. And we can always seek help to avoid our own distress, to manage our own distress, and any kind of assistance with secondary trauma. Then we have strategies for discussing trauma. So we encourage you not to avoid any conversation about trauma with the client, but it is also important to develop these strategies that we mentioned in our past training in June and the ones that I mentioned right now in the previous slide. In this way, we will try to avoid re-traumatizing the client, and we will minimize the client distress. If at some point, for some reason, the client, this is not working, and we have a client that becomes severely distressed, we will then need to respond to the client and help the client return to their baseline level of functioning. So to do this, we can employ many strategies as well. So we'll probably need to take a break, drink some water, practice breathing exercises, doing grounding techniques with the client. And if all this is not working, we might need to end the conversation and we will need to continue that interview at another time. And then the importance of assessment. With very traumatized clients, we need to evaluate if the client is more or less prepared to talk about their trauma history without a high level of distress. So in this case, we always recommend you to consult with a mental health clinician for this and for these specific clients. And it is also essential that as providers are aware how trauma relates to our own beliefs, values, theories and bias related to trauma. So this awareness allows us to manage our internal reaction, to stay present with the client, and also to avoid any kind of discrimination. Next slide. So let's talk about us, right? Let's talk about what can happen to us when we work with traumatized clients, what is vicarious trauma or secondary trauma, and the risk factors of these. So vicarious trauma is the indirect trauma that can occur when helpers are exposed to difficult and disturbing images and stories told by clients and patients. So basically, because of the nature of our job, we can develop a stress response or negative emotions and behaviors that are known as vicarious trauma or secondary trauma. The idea is that supporting people through their traumatic situations, this can be a trauma on its own. So this is why secondary trauma is especially common among helping professionals. There are many risk factors, though, that we can review. For example, having a past history of trauma is one of them. So if I'm a survivor of domestic violence and I'm working with a client who's also a survivor of domestic violence and I can relate to this is obviously going to increase the risk of vicarious trauma. Then we have overwork, which actually can lead to vicarious trauma or to burnout. Ignoring health boundaries. Healthy boundaries are very important. We talked about healthy boundaries in our previous meeting. We are talking about them today. Healthy boundaries have like a double purpose. So healthy boundaries are helping us with the client to give the client transparency, clarity, to help them with a structure. And then this will also help us prevent vicarious trauma. So obviously ignoring this is a risk factor for vicarious trauma. Then we have taken on too much, like overwork. This can lead to both vicarious trauma and burnout. Then we have lack of experience or too much experience. Most research actually tell us that very junior professionals are at most risk of developing vicarious trauma, but that doesn't mean that people with more seniority or with too much experience are not exposed to this and cannot develop vicarious trauma. And then the last three obviously can also increase the likelihood of having vicarious trauma, which are working with large numbers of traumatized children, working with large numbers of clients who suffered with dissociative disorders, and having too many negative clinical outcomes as well. Next slide. And this is a very popular wheel that reflects the impact of trauma in service providers. And this was developed by the Trauma Stewardship Institute. We're not going to review all of these, just a few of them. So we will share the PowerPoint after this training. And our recommendation, as always, is that you review these slides and that you engage in self-reflection. So I'm going to start mentioning some of them. I'm going to go clockwise. So the first one that we have is feeling helpless and hopeless. So this is basically feeling that what we are doing is not worthy, that was the point in what we are doing, that it is not going to work what we are doing. Then we have a sense that one can never do enough. So this might be stuck in this loop of autopilot, doing and feeling guilty if I'm taking vacation, feeling guilty if I'm taking any time off, feeling shame that I might not be enough. Then we can, for example, discuss minimizing. Minimizing is basically not having compassion for yourself. Like if you are in pain, you might think, well, it's not that bad. It doesn't hurt that much. Or if you have a personal problem, you might be thinking, well, other people are in worse circumstances than I am, right? So this is basically avoid dealing with your own issues. Then we have chronic exhaustion or physical ailments. So suddenly, for example, our heart backs every other day, or we have headaches like all the time, something that perhaps it didn't happen before. Then we can review dissociative moments. So this can go from feeling that we are perhaps lost in the moment to feeling that our brain is broken, right? So this can also actually relate to another one that was before, this diminished creativity, which can be the incapacity to see any options, right? That we are stuck and we are not able to see other alternatives to the problem. Then we have a sense of persecution. So this can be feeling in extreme distress. worrying for everything in distress, constantly seeking safety. We also have inability to empathize, numbing. Some experts actually call this compassion fatigue, and this can manifest in different ways. So it can be feeling numb or disconnected, not being able to relate to others, or even lack of energy to care for others. Then we have addictions. Addictions can also manifest in different ways. So this is not just like drugs related. So we can be addicted to work. We can be addicted to, for example, being right. We can be addicted to feel needed, right? And then the last one that we have here is grandiosity. I like this one. It's an inflated sense of importance related to one's work. So this is basically related to our narcissistic self, feeling that, for example, if we were not here, things will not work, right? And you need to appreciate yourself, but you also need to keep it grounded, and you also need to be realistic. And the reality is that probably if we were not here, probably somebody else would be, right? Next slide. Okay, I'm gonna pass it over to my colleague, Yaciel.
Thanks, Virginia, and hello, everyone. As Virginia has mentioned, this is a complex topic, and for many helping professionals, the work that we do is not only a means to a career or personal development, but it also has an emotional and personal fulfillment element to it, and we need to be mindful to it. And as we engage in advanced trauma-informed care of clients, it is foundational to have an understanding of what we bring into the equation. Honestly, advanced trauma-informed care is much more about the practitioner than actually the client. How well are you attuned to helping the client? How well are you balancing the relationship and the dynamics of engaging with a client? So if it seems like we're talking a lot about how to manage your own impact in terms of the work, that's because advanced trauma-informed care requires practitioners that are healthy and well attuned to be able to focus on the client's needs as well. So in terms of burnout and the impact of the work, burnout is basically a feeling of being depleted or drained and not bringing our full selves into the work, either conscientiously or unconscientiously. And it can result in emotional exhaustion. It can result in a posture of cynicism or just detachment from the work, and also feelings of inefficacy. And some of the key characteristics of burnout are very important, because usually when we realize that we are experiencing burnout symptoms is because it's already taken hold. And we want to be very vigilant. And I think, as I mentioned in the previous training, if you were part of it, to exercise a lot of emotional hygiene and other parts of a vigilant and balanced approach to the work. Usually burnout is progressive, is silent, and it's also reactive, meaning that it progresses and it takes footing while you're not really looking silently, and you start to notice it once you start to react, once it leads you to behave in a particular way. And you can see some of the examples on the graphic on the slide in terms of what it means to experience burnout in terms of physical symptoms or emotional, cognitive areas, as well as behavioral and work related. You can see that physically you may have headaches and sleep disturbances. Sleep disruption is very common, as well as digestive issues. And emotionally, irritability, a lot of difficulty concentrating, increased doubts and uncertainty, even about your own ability, or decision fatigue. There's a lot of decision fatigue that happens when one is experiencing burnout. At the end of the day, you're so depleted that you do not know what you want to even have for dinner, or the basic decisions that you want to make in your personal life are completely derailed. Takeout becomes an existential crisis in order for you to, if you want to order dinner out, because the impact of making yet another decision, as mundane as it may be, it is something that's pressing. And you can see other things in terms of work, reduced job commitment, low career satisfaction. You're thinking about becoming, instead of being an attorney, you now want to be, I don't know, a bread baker, and find things that are completely distant from what your everyday life is. I mean, some of us want to become bread bakers in general. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's burnout. But when you start to dissociate from your everyday work life and thinking of just experiencing very different and polarized lifestyles, then you may want to start thinking whether or not it is an indication that something is happening with the work that you're doing. As Virginia mentioned, compassion fatigue, it is a real thing, and I'll speak a little bit more about it in the upcoming slides, because it does, it's sort of like a piece of tape that you have, the same piece of tape or Scotch tape, whatever tape, you keep using it over and over and over and over without giving it a break. Eventually that tape is not going to stick anymore. And so compassion fatigue is similar to that, where you are pouring so much, so constantly, and so deeply that eventually you become a bit numb in your ability to involve yourself with others and see others in a empathic light, and so you become a bit indifferent towards their suffering. Next slide, please. And it's important to address burnout in very intentional ways, because it is key for you to be able to sustain your work. As burnout is progressive, and it is silent, and it is reactive, you have to address it in a similar manner. You have to be intentional about it. You have to be premeditated about what you're going to do. So the opposite of what burnout is, you want to be that, and you want to be open with yourself and have open communication, not keep it in the dark, not keeping it hidden in terms of, oh, I noticed that this is not really working out for me. Well, I'm going to keep it hidden as long as I can, because I don't want to deal with it. And that you do not want to do that, because you will be really feeding the burnout monster even more. So you need to name it. You need to focus on relationships. Usually relationships are definitely impacted when you're experiencing some sort of burnout or compassion fatigue. You want to know your limits. You want to have robust boundaries that we'll talk about more. Be aware of systemic power dynamics. For example, you and a system, or you and people, you and the clients, are you becoming very top down? Is it your word is final and nothing else, and the client's agency is being diminished? Are you adopting a savior syndrome or a hero syndrome, where you see yourself making all the decisions and not really allowing for a collaborative process with the client or clients to engage in the work? And you want to make sure that you make empathy or compassion a primary currency in your interactions, including yourself, making sure that you allow yourself for time and space to be able to actually see the impact that the work is taking on you. There, on the graph there, we have a number of strategies that you can explore in terms of behavioral aspects, cognitive, physical, spiritual, emotional, things like assessing your workload and or developing a new way of engaging with your work, seeking help from colleagues if you need to in terms of behavior at work, or assessing whether or not your values and the agency values or your workplace values are aligned, and making that analysis of the things that you may not be fully in for, that are primary to the agency or the organization, and how you're going to balance that. It doesn't mean that you have to create a tension or conflict, but it has to be an awareness of how those things may be triggered for you because you're not fully aligned with what those values mean for you. Engaging in physical exercise, healthy diet and nutrition, spiritual space or practice that may be important for you or that you want to explore, as well as practicing gratitude and ensuring that you have a good social support and connections to be able to do the work. Next slide, please. And so we continue to talk about strategies, and some are very key: boundaries, clear and consistent boundaries, healthy balance in life. Sleep is key, nutrition is key, quality time and physical activity for yourself and those around you. Mindfulness, so having your kind of hip pocket, breathing, grounding, and techniques and relaxation for when you feel that things are getting a bit too tense or too heavy for you. Therapeutic interventions, traditional therapy or other therapeutic spaces you may be able to engage with. Centering practices, which may or may not be spiritual, such as prayer, meditation, nature walks, expressive dance, whatever you feel that connects you to what your definition of spirituality is. And relationships, trust-based, diverse, mutually enriching, intentional relationships are key. Self-awareness is a primary intervention for burnout. You knowing yourself, as we've all heard, knowing thyself is the beginning of wisdom, and it is the case now as well. Knowing yourself, knowing what some of your triggers are and your responses to life in general is a very good way to start monitoring whether or not you have any impact. There are many tools out there that can help measure vicarious traumatization or compassion fatigue. Some of the ones that are most known and studied are listed there if you at any point want to kind of venture in that direction. I highlighted specifically the professional quality of life scale, which is on the graph, and it's basically a series of questions that are very simple in nature, but can illustrate a lot of what you may be struggling with. Number one is, am I happy? And you rate it from 1 to 5. And am I preoccupied with things and things like that? So keep in mind that there are other interventions and other tools in the event that you feel that you definitely need more directed support for vicarious traumatization and or stress, chronic stress, including any support and tools that your organization or workplace may offer as employee wellness support. Next slide, please. Talking about boundaries is key, as we mentioned. Being a healthy practitioner is the number one step to being trauma-informed to support clients. Boundaries are a set of rules, guidelines, or expectations established in a professional relationship to minimize a client worker power differential, as well as vulnerability and potential harm. It is the framework for a relationship of trust. If you do not have healthy boundaries, you probably are going to go to one of the extremes that we're going to mention in a slide coming up. And it's going to really be detrimental, very much detrimental to your relationship with a client, but also the sustainability of your work with that population. Boundary crossings are usually unintentional, well-meaning deviations from standard protocols, and those may be protocols that your organization has established, that your discipline has established, and or that you professionally espouse. There are many ethical standards that we follow, whether you are a social services, a mental health practitioner, or a legal practitioner, or any other type of discipline that we have to abide by in terms of our ethical obligations. But there are also boundaries that are not as clearly defined by the discipline, but are overall accepted ways in which we engage with clients and those that we are serving. Boundary violations are egregious, many times cumulative patterns of behavior where the practitioner disregards both ethical as well as general social or engagement norms that result in detrimental impact to the client. Next slide, please. This is the video that we want to play as we continue the conversation. So I'll just We'll play it now and then I'll continue. Thank you. Can we hear the video? I'm not sure if everyone can hear it.
Yeah, let me just try to.
Empathy. It's very interesting.
Can you hear it now?
Is a nursing scholar who studied professions, very diverse professions where empathy is relevant, and came up with 4 qualities of empathy: perspective taking, the ability to take the perspective of another person or recognize.
Maybe Marianne, if you can restart it, because when you go on mute, we can't hear it anymore.
It's just a technical challenge. It is not moving back and forth. Is the slides moving back and forward? No. Yeah.
No, it is frozen at the beginning.
Yeah. Then let me just let it play out and then see if I can move on to the next slide. And this will be shared. The video will be shared as part of the slides that we share. So in the meantime, perhaps you can close your eyes and listen to the lovely Brene Brown's voice.
Perfect. Thank you.
Okay, I believe that the rest of the participants are not seeing or hearing anything. So just bear with me one moment. I'm going to stop sharing and just restart that. We may need to skip the video. I feel like it might have just interrupted, but rest assured you'll get it when we share the slides. So.
Perfect. While you do that, I can summarize a little bit of the content. So the video is basically highlighting what empathy is, and it's our ability to put ourselves in someone else's position, not necessarily with a sense of pity, but a sense of understanding where they are coming from, and having a response that allows for connection with that individual, so that it doesn't feel like we are just saying, oh, things are really bad for you, oh well, and then moving more towards a more empathic way of engaging with others. One of the reasons why we want to share that video is because it is a good reminder that empathy is the primary currency when we are engaging in this type of work. And boundaries have the tendency of, when we do not have strong boundaries, we have the tendency of not being empathic truly, but deviating to other spaces where empathy is no longer a primary currency or a primary strategy in our work. So we want to make sure to develop healthy boundaries in a way that makes sense. And that's difficult to do because it requires us to sit with discomfort and ambiguity. It requires us to step back and understand what that person is going through and not necessarily act immediately to try to fix it, and be able to monitor and kind of experience a bit of self-censorship in a way, healthy self-censorship, in the sense that I want to truly understand this individual, extend empathy to them, but not necessarily an immediate solution, which many of us sometimes try to jump to the solution of the problem because we do not want to see someone suffering. So we want to make sure that we keep this spectrum in mind, where we are under-involved with a client is not healthy, where we are over-involved with a client is not healthy, because under-involvement leads to disinterest, neglectful behavior. Over-involvement is usually a boundary violation. We want to understand that limitations or boundaries should not be what defines your boundary. Limiting yourself and keeping yourself in check and being in fear of crossing a line is not the intent. It's more to be able to move within a healthy space between that spectrum. And if we could click next to see the middle of the slide to come. So we want the healthy relationship focus to be in this zone of healthfulness, which is balance. You want to be involved with the client as much as needed, but you also want to have a healthy sense of detachment, in the sense that you are not the only person that's helping the client. You are not the savior that's coming to sweep up the client in your, shining horse and getting them to their destination. You want to consistently monitor what your response is, just as a meta exercise of what am I bringing in this relationship? Why do I have this need to go out in the middle of the night and help this client? Is that really what is needed here? And so being mindful of that, so that you don't get into a punitive kind of mindset of, oh, I did this wrong, I should have not done that. No, you should have a balance in your approach so that you can sustain the support that you can give the client and also have a healthy way to do so. Next slide, please. So developing a personal philosophy of boundaries is key, because it will allow you to have what are those anchoring practices, those anchoring thoughts, and just overall definitions that you want to engage with as you practice with a very vulnerable populations, which inevitably are going to bring a level of vulnerability to you. It may not be financial vulnerability as they have, but it may be some emotional vulnerability as you engage with other human beings and in their suffering. You want to identify your non-negotiables. What are the things that you are not willing to compromise? What are the things that you definitely want to keep as part of your practice, or do not want to include in your practice? What are the things that bring you joy or sense of wholeness? What are some basic ideal outcomes that you want out of this work? And are those related to your satisfaction or the client's goals or well-being? You always want to balance those out to make sure that you're not going too into your own satisfaction and now it is about you, or too deep into the client's well-being in the sense that you now are forgetting of yourself. You want to identify a range, and what is success defined as in this relationship with clients? What makes you most successful with the clients? What makes you least engaged, and what are those things that you want to be mindful of? What which actions or words help you build trust or undermine it, both within yourself and your ability to help others, but also in that relationship with others, and organizational policies that inform or limit your response. You'll always want to be mindful of those, because you do not want to enter into a tension or a conflict with your own organization in terms of violating things that are key that you should not be doing as you engage with clients. And finally, you want to make sure that you monitor your motivation. What is driving your actions? Are your motives neutral in terms of emotions as much as you can? They're never going to be fully 100% neutral, but you want to minimize your actions as a derivative of an emotional response, and do so more as a practice that you're engaging with clients. How do your actions impact clients? You may have the best intention, and you may actually want to go 150% for that client. But for a client that has experienced egregious neglect in life and a lot of traumatic experiences, when you go 150% and are there 100% of the time, When it comes time to say goodbye to that client, because your work will end at some point, you now are introducing a very destabilizing relationship pattern for that client, because you are no longer going to be able to be there for them in that manner, or you're not able to be there for a client in the middle of the night when they feel like they need that response from you. And so having a balanced response is actually trauma informed, because you're not setting clients up for unrealistic expectations once your specific relationship with them ends, because it is a timed, bound, and very specific relationship. It's not a lifelong relationship in the same manner that you're having it now. And do your actions credibly add to the client's well-being or leave a deficit? It's what you always want to be asking yourself. Next slide, please. So we have some resources that we want to share with you, setting boundaries for lawyers and law students, some other adverse childhood experiences or ACEs information, and a number of other resources that are there. If you want to peruse through them and take a look, those are very helpful. As always, we welcome your questions in any discussion in the time that we have left, and are always available through email and through your contacts in Europe for any follow-up questions or support that we may offer. Do you have any questions or comments, reactions? Please, I know the chat feature is not fully working, but the Q&A feature, I believe, is working. So please share your questions, if any.
Thank you, Jessica and Virginia. Yes, it's in the Q&A function that you'll be able to post any questions that you have or comments. We did receive a question at the beginning of the session from Jennifer. I just want to clarify one thing with you, Jennifer. You said, do the USG people interviewing refugees, asylum seekers, and similar get this sort of training? Are you referring to US government, kind of entities, authorities, asylum officers? Is that who you're speaking about? Perfect, yes. So Dasael or Virginia, would you like to?
Yeah, I can chime in. So the US government has its own structure to support children. A lot of it in the past years has been very intentional. A lot of the work that's happening with unaccompanied minors, intentional about including social services components, including a trauma-informed, culturally responsive approach as much as possible. Obviously, every agency has its standards and works. So I cannot definitively answer whether or not they do this type of training, but I know that in a lot of the work and a lot of the standards that are shared as to how to best engage with unaccompanied minors, refugees, and immigrants and immigrant youth and migrating youth in nature in general, they do have incorporated some trauma-informed care and advise those of us who are working with the population to also do so. I know that at Kind and many other providers, we are very intentional about supporting these conversations, because we know that those go hand in hand. For example, the American Bar Association has a lot of resources along the same lines, because we understand that legal services cannot operate in a vacuum without some trauma-informed and culturally attuned support. So as it relates to the government, I'm not sure, but I know that the culture of nonprofit culture in the US, legal service providers and the like, do hold in high regard these type of trainings. And we collaborate a lot with different partners across the US and Mexico as well, to ensure that the content is aligned with these practices. Hope that answers your question.
Thank you, Jessica. We also have a question from Daria. She said, is there a way to understand whether we suffer from compassion fatigue or burnout due to other factors, as it looks to me that some of the symptoms will be the same?
That is an excellent question. Thank you for asking it. I think that's one of the reasons why I say that self-awareness is a primary, response or prevention to this. And Virginia mentioned, and I welcome Virginia to also chime in, the fact that previous experience can exacerbate the rate in which you may experience burnout or compassion fatigue. I have, for example, spoken with practitioners, legal practitioners in the past where they would say, well, I had a life experience that is now coming up and bringing this up for me, and I see it impacting me. And so it may not actually be the work itself, but more what that person had experienced in the past. So I think it's both. It's not an either or question, it's a both and. If you live a very stressful home life, it's inevitably going to trigger much more of an impact when you hear stories that align with a very stressful environment. And so I think it's a matter of both personal and environmental, as well as the work itself. The work never happens in a vacuum. It happens through human beings and what human beings experience and the human experience. And so you want to be mindful of that when your life experiences and or your environment or current experiences are aligning to possibly giving you a higher vulnerability to burnout. You want to be mindful, but work can also bring that into your personal life. And so that's why you want to have a balanced approach in both. We're not only preventing burnout at work, because that doesn't work. We're preventing burnout across the span of your experience, both in the personal, in the relational, and in the professional. Rina, I don't know if you have any other comments.
No, I mean, I echo that you say. My only recommendation is when you think about all these is that, for example, if you are doing any of these questionnaires to see if you have compassion fatigue or you're burnout or if you are showing some symptoms of secondary trauma, my only recommendations is to engage in self-reflection. So you are not answering these questionnaires like a robot, right? Like, oh, I'm not happy. Oh, I'm having like meaningful relationships out of work, things like that. Like every time that you are answering any of these, you kind of like sit down and self-reflect, okay, what is going on behind this? Why I'm not having meaningful relationships? Why I'm like dealing with this? Is because of something that happened, not work related. It is because of my work. It is because of all of us, as Jessica said, we all come with our own backpacks, so our own experiences. So self-reflection is very important. So that would be my recommendation when trying to differentiate why is the reason that this is happening to you.
Thank you. And we have received one last question, one very interesting one from Siddiq. He asked, when we're already in that situation of perhaps unintentionally getting too much involved, maybe getting into that boundary violation kind of space, how do we deal with that? How do we kind of wind back from that back into the space of more healthy boundaries?
That's very interesting, and I can get us started, Virginia, if you have anything to add. You always want to, and ironically, in this helping profession and helping relationship, you always want to start with the end in mind. And so setting expectations with clients that at some point this relationship may shift, right? And so initially, the first response is you set up your relationship so that you never get into that, right? But if you do get into a relationship dynamic where you feel like you're going too deeply into it, I think one of the primary strategies is to be clear and honest with the client in the manner that it is developmentally appropriate with the client, right? You're not going to say to a 5-year-old, we're done, I'm too involved with you, only call me at 2 p.m. On Friday, right? So it's not possible. So you want to introduce that in developmentally appropriate ways. For example, if you only work within a certain time frame during the day, you want to let the clients know that, and in a gently trauma-informed way, say, I just want to remind you that if you call me at a certain hour, I may be actually be having dinner, or I may be actually doing something else. So the hours in which you can best find me are between 9 to 4 p.m. or whatever it is. And so having clarity and transparency with the client is important so that they can be better informed on where they are in the relationship. And walking back certain practices that you may have established, just because you started them doesn't mean that you have to perpetuate them, but you want to inform the client of it. Well, next time we meet, I know that we always go out to lunch. And next time we meet, I may just have some cookies for you in the office, and we won't be spending, our lunch, 2-hour lunch as we did before. And then you gradually introduce that so that the client knows that the expectations are going to be different. Again, trauma robs us of control and also predictability. You do not want to, out of the blue, introduce a very drastic change in the relationship unless it is safety-wise necessary. But if it is not, you want to be trauma-informed in the sense that you want to return to the relationship some of that predictability and some of the control, and maybe ask the client, next time I can't go out to lunch with you for 2 hours, but I can have cookies or biscuits, or I may have some fruit. What would you prefer, so that I can have it ready when we meet next time? And so that gives some control of the client to the client, and also it redirects your relationship so that you don't have to have a 2-hour lunch every time you meet with a client. I hope that helps. And Virginia, I don't know if you have any other thoughts.
Yeah, another suggestion that I was going to make is to start involving other helping professionals in this child or youth life. So as Yaciel mentioned before, we want to avoid at all costs to have this savior syndrome, that we are the only person in this youth life that can support. So consider if there is any other attorney in the office that can support the youth, paralegal, perhaps a social worker. Consider also referring this child or this youth to another organization. Perhaps the client has, like, I don't know, any artistic inclination. We can refer them to any youth supporting organization. Perhaps there are other people out there that can support this youth, so this youth doesn't feel that we are the only ones that they have who can help them.
Thank you, Jessiel and Virginia. And thanks for the presentation today, which, I think many of us will see ourselves in a lot of the things that you've spoken about, particularly around, the potential for burnout and understanding where the framework of healthy boundaries lies. And, hopefully the awareness and the resources and the tools that you've shared will be useful to you all. And, if there are aspects to anything that came up today that you're interested to learn more about, either with tools or in terms of further training, please just put it into the short survey that will be shared. It'll automatically come up in your browser once the webinar ends. Very, very short, but any thoughts, feedback would be greatly appreciated. Just to remind you all that the slides also will be shared, so you'll have a chance to see the video that we were technically not able to show today. And then the recording of the whole session will be available on Kind's YouTube channel, and we'll send you all a link afterwards. So thank you all for joining us today. Apologies that we've run a little over, but I think that those were excellent questions that I think it was important to make time to respond to. So thank you all, and hopefully we will see you soon for another session.